This week we have a return visit from Professor Patrick Dunleavy, who spoke last week about the UK party system, or party system and party politics. And this week, as you can see, he's going to talk about governance, ideology, and policy.
Great. Okay, well, thanks very much. Apologies that somebody's just told me that the lecture isn't up on Moodle yet, or isn't available yet. And I'll certainly ask Matthew to make sure it is, because he's had it for some time. What I'm going to be doing today is sort of the second part of what we kicked off doing last week. So last week was all about the electoral basis for party competition and the party system. And this week, really I'm trying to think about how important parties are in the way that the system of governance works in the UK. And particularly, you know, do they pull together a consistent ideology? Is there a particular British party style of operating the UK core executive, the cabinet, the ministers, parliament, and so on? And really, what's the importance of parties now? So I'm going to, again, just cover those areas in blue. So we've discussed last week the areas in red, so I'm not going to say anything more about them. I'm not going to say too much about party ideologies and cleavages, because it's a sort of, it's pretty much a desystematized kind of party competition now. But you can come back to me in questions and ask me if you think I've overstated that. Then I'm going to look at the main support of the party system now, which is actually the weight of history in many ways. Not just the history of the British Constitution, but the history of the whole British state. So there's really two big institutions that favour some parties. And one of them, surprisingly or not, is the past history of the British Empire, and the other is the importance of Parliament, which is a very strange and esoteric and special kind of institution. Then I'm going to look at how parties recruit elites and how they behave in office and opposition, and finally, how much do they shape public policies. And the 6 kind of propositions I want to put to you, well, the first 3 are these: that party ideologies in Great Britain are fragmenting, that they are not coherent, that they are, in a sense, a rag bag of now different issue-specific positions. So the question is, how do the parties hold together for so long and so consistently, especially the 2 big ones, Conservative and Labour, and also, interestingly now, the Liberal Democrats, who are not a huge party apparatus, but they have proved to be surprisingly robust and able to at least maintain themselves under some acute pressure during the coalition government period. So just really looking particularly at the basis of why we have this governance monopoly between Conservatives and Labour. Of course, it's just broken down since 2010, but what were the basis for that? The first argument being that it was very largely due to the pressures of the imperial governance over a long period of time, but particularly in the late 19th century when Britain was democratizing, partially. Secondly, parliamentarianism. We can come back to some of the, it's based on the electoral biases that we discussed last week, but it has a whole set of institutional biases which help to protect the 2 biggest parties. And thirdly, the centralization of the British state, which is very extreme when you compare it with most other European countries, and also the past historical emphasis of the British state on governmentalism, statist kind of solutions, which has given us a very large state apparatus, particularly the NHS, schooling and other things. And that creates a nice little playground for the 2 big parties to develop a constantly changing set of policies and solutions. And that's very interesting, really, because Britain has lost an enormous amount of policy-making power to the European Union, and British party elites have compensated for their dwindling role by going off and trying to micromanage lots of institutions which they really shouldn't be getting involved with, in my view. But that's really what the what sustains the party debates now, this concern to micromanage things like the NHS and state education. Thirdly, parties remain very important for elite recruitment, but the idea that they channel people in from outside, that they channel voices or opinions or other things in from outside to the state, is increasingly questioned by many political scientists now. And I want to argue that the so-called cartel party model has tremendous applicability to Britain. So parties, you know, represent only the views of activists now. They don't represent anything else, and their function is not really strictly democratic inputs. The fourth thing is that the British party competition has been sustained by a kind of club ethos, which means that competition happens, but it happens in a kind of gentlemanly, okay, that's gender specific, but it is a very gender specific activity so far. We've just done a study of who gets called by select committees to Parliament, and the gender balance was 75% male, 25% female, and so on. So it's a very gendered set of occupations. And there's been this club ethos, which very much comes out of the 19th century gentleman's club in origins, I think, that circumscribes the way in which the Conservative and Labour parties have competed with each other. And it does mean that it constrains UK elite behaviour. We have non-rancorous kinds of competition compared to many other countries. Finally, in this chain of things, we can think about what the party's role is in terms of influencing policy. And the argument I want to make is it's decreasingly important. It may seem difficult to appreciate that when you look at the newspaper and everything, but there are a whole set of processes going on in British society and in all advanced industrial societies, which mean that the ability of any political state type body to control what's going on in different areas of social life is being circumscribed. That's what autopoiesis means. It's a very obscure German theorist's word from a guy called Nicholas Luhmann. It basically means that every system in society is increasingly independent of other systems and runs itself, can't be governed externally. So that's a problem for the state and particularly for political parties who are always trying to suggest that they can get involved and do things that actually they haven't the competence to do, they never have the competence to do, and they certainly don't have it anymore. So that's one big reason why they've lost out. Second is about advocacy coalitions. In the old days we used to have, you know, interest group battles, very well summed up in a sort of a comedy sketch I saw about 2 decades ago, maybe a decade ago. It was set in the Labour Party, and I think it was Mel Smith and Chris Reeve-Jones. And so 10 people are sitting around a table and they're having a really bitter discussion. And Mel Smith says, brothers, we've got to stop here. And it's time for a coffee break or a tea break. So let's have a vote. How many for tea? They go around the table and he goes, oh, that's 185,000 votes. And then he says, and how many for coffee? And he puts his hand out, 350,000 votes. Well, coffee it is. Now that's pure interest group politics. There's no discussion of what's right. It's just, this is my interest, that's your interest. We resolve it by having a battle of numbers. But nowadays, we have what are called advocacy coalitions, and what they're battling about is essentially ideas. And they're battling in public domains where the media and the social media are kings, and parties with their, you know, closed private circuits are increasingly irrelevant. So those are the 5 key propositions, and I'll whip through those fairly quickly. and then focus just on the big change in the party system, which is the 2010 coalition government. It's a huge change, the first peacetime coalition government we've had in Britain since the 1930s. So I want to sort of look at that in a little bit more detail towards the end of the thing. Okay, so let's kick off at the first thing, the fragmentation of party ideological differentiation. And the argument here is essentially that what separates the parties is no longer a coherent set of ideas. There isn't an ideology in the sense of a framework of ideas that hangs together. The debates between party leaders, between front benches, are overwhelmingly debates about managerialist things. They're debates of degree and gradualness, you know, exactly how much should public spending be cut? Should it be cut by 40 billion or should it be cut by 35 billion? Should there be a plan A or a plan B, which is pretty much like A anyway, and so on. So we have a kind of a managerialist culture now in politics. Now how can I prove that to you? Well, I thought, I'm not going to prove it, I was going to illustrate it to you. I thought we would just run over some slides really that condense together a thing that Tony and I did last autumn for the press, where we were trying to summarize what are the different parties standing for and so on. What are they actually offering to voters? What are they specifically committed to doing? So I thought we might just run through them. They're slightly out of date. Perhaps they've changed since. Okay, remembering always that we're citing this within this multi-party competition framework that we basically, we can think about these in left-right terms, but what does that actually mean in public policy differences and specific commitments? Well, here are some Labour things. Now, Labour is working hard at trying to differentiate itself from the government because it's the lead opposition. And you can see that it's pushing a lot on living costs and standards of living. So had a very good autumn with Ed Miliband's pledge to freeze energy prices, which remains to be seen if it's feasible. There's indications that they're going to be backing the living wage, which is an important thing. There's some commitments on childcare. There's one commitment on scrapping an element of the coalition government's welfare reform, which is the bedroom tax that's very extensively detested in some parts of the UK and some cities. There's a pledge to increase house building. Sadly, not something that Labour actually managed to do when in office for 13 years. A little pledge on business rates and scrapping UK corporation tax increases. But right at the bottom we have Ed Balls more or less accepting that what Osborne and co have said in terms of public spending limits is also going to be Labour policy, which currently seems to stretch into the far distant future as far as 2020. So not really all that much in terms of specific commitments. Certain coherence there, but fairly minimalistic. If we think about the Conservatives, it's really quite hard at the moment to see what it is that they're going to offer voters at the next election, which is only next year. So they are definitely proclaiming the end of the recession, arguing that their good housekeeping has paid off. The period of above-trend UK growth is here. This is kind of surprising. I don't know if any of you have ever taken a ball and held it underwater. What happens when you hold it underwater? It pops up, it jumps out of the water for a bit, then it settles down again. So that's really we're in the bobbing out of the water bit, which is not exactly economically a great thing to be in, really. But anyway, that's what they're claiming. They're arguing for maintaining public spending discipline, and there definitely seems to be a sort of underlying coherence that they want to reduce the state share of GDP below 40%, which has never been sustained for any long period of time. Most of their economic recovery is linked to re-encouraging the housing market, and then their pledge to have an EU referendum. So that's the sort of, it's a very minimalist thing that the Conservatives are yet offering. I don't know if you want to count things like Michael Gove yesterday making a speech saying he's going to encourage Latin and Greek in schools, which seems to me to be the ultimate tiny little detail of what a minister shouldn't actually be talking about. But anyway, there is some window on what the Conservatives actually might want that comes from the Liberal Democrats. But let's just look at the Liberal Democrats. They're the other governing party. What are they really specifically committed to? Well, free school meals for children in reception years 1 and 2. They say they're going to do something about student tuition fees. I'm sure all you students really put a lot of hope on what they're saying on tuition fees. They're going to restrict the proliferation of betting shops on high streets, mention tax, and let's have some more nukes. So not exactly totally clear what the ideological coherence of this set of propositions is. But you can get a sense of what the Liberal Democrats stand for and really what the Conservatives stand for, actually in an interesting way, which is a set of 15 policies which, in his last conference speech, Nick Clegg claimed that the Liberal Democrats had stopped Conservative ministers from doing. And so that tells us a bit about both sides. It tells us what the Conservatives would like to do, but are prevented by a coalition from agreeing. And it tells you what the Liberal Democrats have, where their red lines have been in the actual coalition government itself. And you can see that a lot of these are about sticking to a kind of middle of the road thing, not allowing the balance of rights and liberties between companies and workers to be disturbed. Really sort of sticking up for the status quo on the Human Rights Act, and so on. But these things are all fairly specific. So, you know, where the battle lines lie between the parties, where the edges of disagreement are, it's a very much more focused down and rather scrappy, fragmented, sporadic thing. And if we wanted to sort of picture the main ideological divides, we also have to look at UKIP. Now, UKIP produced a 410-page manifesto for the 2010 election, which their leader, Nigel Farage, just in the last 2 weeks has described as drivel. And this had all kinds of very interesting policies in, like, I think making taxi drivers wear ties was one of the, uniform, and so on. And was written by a chap called Campbell Bannerman, who's now gone back to the Conservatives. Anyway, Mr. Farage has torn it up, but we have some very big, concrete and specific pledges from UKIP. And this is interesting because this is a party that is probably going to get 27% of the vote, around about that, 25% of the vote in the elections in May, European elections, and has no MPs, of course. So it's not present in Westminster and is offering options that have not previously been available, really, before its arrival. The first is, let's just leave the European Union. Then we'd have a permanent freeze on immigration of all kinds for 5 years. Get rid of foreign aid, or a lot of foreign aid, because it's going to undeserving countries and home needs are greater. Scrap the sort of Labour and sort of Conservative target of getting 50% of UK school leavers into university. Double prison places, which is a great way of cutting crime. The evidence of that is very mixed, and so on. Right down to let's spend a lot more on defence, but we're also going to have big public spending cuts. We haven't quite worked out how that's going to work, but apparently Roger Bootle is advising UKIP.
Welfare cuts.
welfare cuts, yeah. Okay, so that definitely is what I would call an ideological manifesto. That's a clear ideological statement. It's coherent, hangs together, you can see where the party sits, and it's very radical. It's probably infeasible, but it's radical. And if we put that together with the traditional left-right thing, and think about this EU immigration dimension. So if you're up here, you want to leave the EU and close borders. If you're down here, you want to stay in the EU and keep it open. We might position the parties somewhat like this. So certainly the Liberal Democrats are right of centre now, but they are pro-EU. Labour is definitely warming up on the EU, and the fact that Ed Miliband does not pledge to hold a referendum on EU exit is a very interesting development. The Conservatives I put in here, but they might cover a wider zone because they've got strong internal disagreements. And finally, we've got a very clear UKIP position, slightly obscure Green position. So that's quite a complicated ideological map. And we'll see later on that you can, however, this hasn't always been there. It's particularly been there in this form, I think, since David Cameron pledged to hold a referendum on the EU. But notice he only pledged to hold a referendum. He didn't say clearly that he wanted to leave the EU, and most of the betting is that he and a large proportion of his party elites don't want to leave the EU. But that raises some interesting questions because, traditionally people say the Conservatives are the party of business. 80% of British business doesn't want to leave the EU. Similarly, Conservatives have typically been, for the last period since Margaret Thatcher's time, sort of champions of the free market, and many corporations are champions of continuing immigration. So there are interesting cross pressures there that have been created for the Conservatives between some of their natural funders and backers and big interests, and by the rise of UKIP. Anyway, this creates, when you move off one dimension to two dimensions, you get complexity. When you move beyond two dimensions into 3 or 4 dimensions, we can't picture it, but we have a very complicated set of ideologies. What is it that somehow unites being in favour of phonics in school teaching with favouring the renewal of the Trident nuclear deterrent? What is it about conservatism that links these two policies? It's quite bizarrely difficult on the face of it to say, and yet we seem to have come to sort of believe that this is a natural thing, that if you're in favour of this, then you're also in favour of this, these bundled together. Well, is that actually, does it make any sense in the modern world? So that's the party ideology bit, and we'll see when we get to policy making that it has implications. Now, let's just think about the fact that Britain has strong nationalised parties, so Conservatives and Labour and Liberal Democrats contest every seat. And the question is why we have the kind of structure of two-party competition that we have had over the years. And the first thing I want to get you to think about is think about the late 19th century, which was the defining period when Britain was democratising. And that was also the heyday of the British Empire, which had been around for a long time before that. But it was really, this was the critical formative time for democracy. And at that time, Britain was a pretty schizophrenic system of government. If we looked at it, say, in 1910, Britain was a liberal democracy. Michael Gove has just had a big spat with Blackadder for suggesting that, the First World War wasn't a great liberal democratic crusade. In his view, it was. But actually, the number of people who voted, let's say in the last general election before the First War in October 1910, was 4.9 million people in the UK and Ireland. 40% of manual workers didn't have the vote at this time. And if you go to Ireland, actually only about 96,000 people voted in Ireland because of various franchise restrictions. So this was the democratic hub, the homeland. These were the voters who created the UK Parliament then. And the UK Parliament supported this strange combined dual kind of state, governed by the same people. So the cabinet, the prime minister, the departments, the civil service, the apex was the same. But we have really a huge difference between the home island, which is liberal, has free speech, has various not very well protected, but actually customarily quite well upheld sets of rights and freedoms and so on, and has a democratic political debate and so on, and has an island state kind of system with local government and democracy at different levels. But if we shift it over to the imperial state, the fundamental problem for the imperial state was keeping 400 million subject peoples, almost all of them universally not white peoples, subjected. That was the fundamental job of the imperial state. And that was essentially a despotic system of government. Of course, the British like to pretend that their imperial rule was better than everybody else's imperial rule, somehow more friendly or more well-intentioned or whatever. But actually it was pretty similar to the French, the Belgian, the Dutch, the Spanish, and later on the German and Italian. So that's a system where you have the same political elites trying to meet democratic inputs of a rather limited kind in the home island and trying to suppress virtually all democratic impulses in the empire. And that creates a kind of schizophrenia in your government system. The philosopher George Santayana analyzed it very well when he was apparently applying it to Athens, but he said, you know, once you start running an empire, it takes over your whole system of government, and it shapes the way in which you do things in a very deep and committed way. And that was particularly true in Britain, because these Irish voters had the annoying habit of sometimes holding the balance between the Conservatives and the Labour and the Liberal elites, as they were at that time, Conservatives versus Liberal. And what happened is the Conservative and Liberal elites jointly decided in the 1880s to pass various kind of changes to the standing orders of Parliament, which persist to this day, and which were designed to prevent the Irish from ever controlling imperial government. And in particular, many of the restrictions that apply to the British Parliament to this day were enacted at this time, of which the most important is a very obscure part of the House of Commons standing orders, which says that no MP can legitimately move a resolution that will increase the spending of the British government by £1 unless they have a certificate signed by a minister saying that their Treasury agrees, which of course they never get. So that whereas if you go to the USA or most legislatures, it's possible for MPs to propose increases in spending, that's completely forbidden in the British House of Commons. And if you move a resolution of that kind, it gets struck down and it doesn't proceed any further because it's against the standing orders. So that's the foundation for British budgetary discipline and so on. And the real key part was imperial defence. That was the really tricky thing that elites worried a great deal about, and which took up an enormous amount of Whitehall and Westminster's time and attention. There were some white dominions which were given self-government pretty early on, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. So if we update that now, well, not now, but let's say in the 1980s, we still had a little colonial thing. We had Hong Kong and various other bits and pieces floating around. But we weren't really suppressing them. Well, we were suppressing Hong Kong, but in terms of democratic government. But what had really developed in its place very gradually over the 20th century was a very large-scale secret state, which we still have. We have a very overdeveloped set of intelligence services, and particularly in GCHQ, now famous for its very under-the-wire kind of partnering with the National Security Agency in the USA, a very, important sustainer of Britain's external influence in the United Nations and in the alliance with the USA. And we also have a very, we had for a long period of time, we sustained the illusion of an independent nuclear deterrent, which we're still committed to doing. I mean, the current government is committed to doing it. There's some voices against renewing Trident, but we still have this really extraordinarily large defense intelligence kind of establishment. Of course, we've now got a fully democratic process, and so some of the sort of schizophrenia is still, reduced and gone away, but there are still relics of that period. For example, how do we control our intelligence services through Parliament? Well, we have a select committee of Parliament, chaired by Sir Malcolm Rifkind. The average age of the committee is, I think, 66. All of the members have worked as ministers in the intelligence and they are not elected by MPs, as other select committees are, but they are appointed on the recommendation of the Prime Minister. There's one woman out of 9, and there's one person under 64 on the committee. And this is the body which has assured us that everything GCHQ did with the National Security Agency of the USA is fully okay, and no invasion of your individual human rights have taken place, and nothing illegal has been done. And they know that on the basis of what this committee, with its almost complete lack of any investigative or other staff, has gleaned from asking people from the security and intelligence services. So that's still it's a last few relics of schizophrenic government that has to be shielded away from normal political control. And incidentally, if you want to know how much these agencies are spending, you can't find out, because the numbers are hidden away in the budget. So deliberately to make sure that enemies of the state can't discover. So that's a very important basis, and it's still sort of working through the system to this day. The second big thing that has sustained two-party competition in Britain is what Ralph Miliband used to call parliamentarianism. And this is the whole cult of Parliament as a centre of decision-making and as a representative body. And within Parliament, there are sort of sub-bits of this overall ideology of parliamentarianism where the majority party is given, assigned a lot of influence in determining the agenda of Parliament. So it's a Parliament that is extensively and completely controlled by executive decision-making. It's begun to be a little bit more independent in the last few years, in the last couple of decades, with the growth of select committees, and particularly since the implementation of the Tony Wright reforms in 2009, where select committees have been elected and they've elected their chairs, and they've begun to become a little bit sort of authentic legislative bodies. But for the rest, if you look at the legislative process in Parliament, first reading, second reading, committee reading, the dominant expectation all the way through is that the government is in charge of the timetable, the government is going to win every vote. 97% of amendments are rejected, and only government amendments are accepted. And meanwhile, we have an opposition which sort of accepts all of this in a kind of collaborative spirit. So the job of the opposition is to support the government in steamrolling its program through, getting things done, and so on, because all of these benefits will then accrue to the opposition if the electoral pendulum swings, if and when it swings, and they become the party in power. And the fundamental basis of this, really, the whole two-party system, is the existence of very, very strong biases in the country as a whole in terms of who wins seats across different regions of the country. So this shows you the 2005 general election, and along the bottom axis we have the effective number of parties that we discussed last week in terms of votes. But you can also compute that up the vertical axis in terms of seats. Okay? And so if we had any region of the country where there were more parties winning seats than winning votes, that would imply that there wasn't any reduction taking place. If we had any region of the country that was on this line, this horizontal line here, that would mean that the number of parties that people had voted for was being reflected accurately in the number of parties who were winning seats in the House of Commons. Actually, in 2005, the only region of the country that got at all close was the southwest, where long-lived conservative predominance had been challenged by the Liberal Democrats. Actually, that wasn't completely disproportional. That was a region of the country where things were going all right. But you can see that in the other regions of the country, the level of disproportionality, how far you were reducing parties was very, very extreme, so that the number of parties winning seats was much lower than the number of parties people were voting for. So in the northeast, for example, voters supported 2.8 parties, and in terms of seats, 1.2. So uniquely to this day, Darlington is the apogee of disproportionality in the UK. And all these red lines show you Labour regions that are sharply disproportional. But then the blue lines covering the southeast and the east of the country, and these are very big regions, are areas where the Conservatives are affected. And if we looked at this for 2010, unfortunately I haven't got this for 2010 yet, but you'd see that the Conservatives did pretty well, and Labour, being on the back foot in 2010, did less well than this. So that's really an artificially created predominance in the electoral system in terms of who wins seats. And then the whole ethos of the Commons, the House of Commons, the two sides of the chamber, the government and opposition, loyal opposition roles, all those sorts of things are part and parcel of a completely fake representation of British politics, which is continuously renewed and continuously favours Conservatives and Labour. I'm running a bit behindhand, so I'm going to just skip over centralisation. But let me just say to you that if you look around the Western world and you think, where are there single units of government of 55 million people being governed centrally? Anybody got any candidates? Can you think of any other liberal democracy where there's a unit of 55 million people being run by the central government directly? There is one other, which is Japan, which is bigger than us. Sort of 125 million people with local government, but nothing else. But almost every other country in the world now has 3 or 4 levels of government. and has a devolved and decentralized system. And that's true, for example, of France, which used to be the classic Bonapartist centralized system, now has 4 tiers of government with a lot of regional decentralization. So the UK is very centralized, and it's very Whitehall dominated, and it's very dominated by Fabian Labour Party centralization ethos still, which has been taken a long time to dismantle. Okay, so that's why we have still this impression of two-party predominance. It's slowly changing, but it's very slow to change. And there's a modern reason why this is, and that is that parties across liberal democracies are no longer really vehicles for citizens to influence the state. They're instead become, if you like, vehicles for the state to influence citizens. That's the argument of Katzenmayer in this standard, which you've probably seen before, 4-phase model of party system. So you start off with elite-run parties run by notables, and every now and again they have a general election and go out and energize people. But basically it's a sort of, the state is part of an elite notable network, and the voting is sort of a little bit supportive or tangential really to the main process. Then in the late 19th century we move into the period of mass parties with the formation particularly of the labour movement, the trade unions, social democratic parties, and then their imitation by liberal and conservative parties across most of Europe and in the USA. And then we have parties which were for a long time quite vibrant, they recruited millions of people in Britain. They were vibrant social and political entities. They really pulled together a lot of people's social life, and they expressed and were linked to a great deal of their social life. In the 20th century, especially after 1945, we had a transition away from mass parties, which is still going on to this day, and parties began to emphasize more media appeals, leadership appeals, and a kind of creation of a catch-all party where we didn't just recruit from this block, we recruited from different blocks. So we could vary the appeal. And so you had a broadening of social appeal and a de-emphasis on the sort of traditional ideological polarities. And then the final stage of this development, which we're really in very strongly in the UK, is a situation where parties are joined only by people who want to become activists and want to have political careers. And that's particularly true of the Labour Party, where the whole recruitment of MPs and so on is dominated by people coming in from trade unions and the media, and in the Conservative Party, where it's also sort of related to things like rural England and business-type influences. So parties have very small memberships now, 180,000 if you're lucky for the Conservatives and the Labour Party, maybe 60,000 for the Liberal Democrats, maybe less now. They draw a lot of funding from the state, not so much in Britain compared to European countries, but insofar as funding is very carefully regulated by the state, then there's a great deal of state supervision of parties now. And the argument of this model is that parties have sort of changed function, even sort of changed sides. They're now ways in which the state gets to explain policy debates to people, gets people to express their views. They're not authentically grounded in the social world as they once were. But that's a challenging kind of argument, and it's one that, of course, most people in political parties reject, because it creates, the cartel party creates the idea of a sort of quasi-clientelist system. But it's a very interesting perspective, I think. Well, I'm running behind on club ethos, and I've sort of covered that, so I'll skip over that. Just focus lastly, really, on what role do parties play in policy making? If they had clear ideologies, if you could predict from the sort of framing of what the party stood for, how were they going to react on different things, then you could see that this would begin to play a role. And parties still do that. There's still a sort of gut instinct kind of thing. And some political leaders, Mrs. Thatcher was adept at that, at, you know, developing very simple mnemonics, which people in lots of different settings could sort of think, if we propose this, what will Mrs. Thatcher say? And it would be something like private sector good, public sector bad, in her case, or market good, state sector bad, or something like that. But the question is whether this kind of ideological integration still works anymore. And the argument of the autopoiesis theme is that you just can't run complex modern societies in this kind of way. If you introduce the bedroom tax, for example, because you want to encourage people to go out to work and you want to cut down on excess accommodation for benefits claimants, but then you don't actually have any accommodation for people to move out of, or you're just going to impoverish a whole quota of people. And that's the kind of difficulty that you get into when you have very partisan policy making. And usually we get a bit of a push on these things and it doesn't work. It doesn't work either because political competition now is not interest-based. It's essentially knowledge-based. It's a competition between alternative coalitions who are advocating alternative courses of action for very different reasons. So, for example, think about, I don't know, smoking in cars, which was an issue that came up. Should we ban smoking in cars? Well, we have like the medical people saying that we should. We have children's groups arguing that it's very unfair for, you know, children to be exposed to smoke. And then over on the other hand, we have people from the freedom of association saying, no, we've got to oppose this on, you know, not building a nanny state. And of course we have the tobacco companies in various disguised forms arguing for the continued existence of their market and their products. So really we have competition going on all the time between lots of different interests, organized interests, most of which emphasize now the development of cognitive competition. So we've got the research that shows that your position is untenable. Think about, for example, the government at one point was proposing to increase the speed limit on motorways to 80 miles per hour, and then they didn't because all the evidence was unremittingly on the line that this would, you know, be worse for the social welfare and increase the number of accidents. And finally, we have a whole process where parties used to govern behind closed doors. They used to govern in a very private world. And it used to mean something that you were a party member, that you could go along to a meeting and you would learn things and you could influence things, you could influence a party platform and so on. But now party leaders don't need activists and regional committees and constituency level committees to do this kind of stuff. They have professional social scientists who can come in and do it for them. They have speechwriters, they have pollsters, they have press agents and press officers and communication experts. They have focus groups. They can do all this stuff in a top-down way. They don't need the parties. And so what happens is party elites do this sort of stuff in a top-down kind of way, and then it gets media exposition, and then the party elites try and see whether this worked or not and tweak the policies accordingly. And it's not just media now, but increasingly social media. So political blogging, for example, is very important. Even now, political tweeting is very important. So there's just really a vanishing role for parties within this whole set of developments. Now, I haven't got onto the coalition, but I've got some slides. And let's.
We started late, Patrick. Do the coalition.
Well, I think what I could do is just sort of skip through all this. Well, I'll show you two slides. The first, this one is potentially of use to those of you who are planning a political career. And it's my new way of explaining political power. Political power is always based on resources. That's one thing it's based on. And then the other big thing it's based on is coalitionality, which is a very obscure sounding word, but basically means how attractive are you as a partner in a coalition. And sometimes, in amongst the resources, we have what we call a key resource. And if there's a key resource, that can determine what some people call a power index, but which I think is better described as a coalitional potential. Now, if we're thinking about forming a coalition government, the key resource that you need is the number of MPs that you have. And the coalitional potential you can express as the likelihood that you're going to be the swing actor creating a majority coalition. So there are, 648, or there were 646 MPs in the House of Commons. You needed 323 in order to win. The key resource there is MPs. There are various other things that you could think about when you're forming a coalition, like reputation, past record in government. And then one thing that a lot of parties think about, because they're very office-orientated things, they're about getting the gains from political power nowadays, political office nowadays, is how much will we have to give up of the goodies of office in order to do a deal with other people. And over on the coalitional appeal side, there's the question of whether you can actually help them to get to a majority. Then the next big thing is how proximate you are and how much you have common interests or not. So if we look at the 2010 general election, the key thing that happened was that the electorate created only two winning coalitions, two possible winning coalitions. One was the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, and another was not on this list at all. What's the other one?
Labour.
Yeah, Conservative and Labour, exactly, yeah. And that's not on this list because of various reasons that we can discuss. So if you look at the other options, except for the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, the only one that was a possible majority coalition, and even then by the smallest of numbers, was something with the Labour in, the Liberal Democrats, the SNP, the Plaid Cymru, and probably you'd have had to add the Social Democratic and Labour Party from Northern Ireland, which is problematic because the British parties don't like including Irish parties now, just as they didn't in the 1880s. Still lingering on. So really, the question that a lot of people have debated is whether there was, once we knew the number of MPs, we could construe the coalitionality or the power of the parties. And I've done this. I'll just let's focus on the top three. Let's ignore all the other little small fry. So this is the key thing: is how many MPs have you got, and what proportion of the overall weighting? The Conservatives had 48%, Labour had 40% of MPs, Liberal Democrats had just under 9%, and the rest small numbers. So then the question is, what does that say in terms of power or coalitional potential? And there's an index that is explained in my wonderful chapter that's part of the reading for this. I'll leave you to read it. But basically, what it shows is that on this index, the Tories had 37% of the power, and then most of the rest was divided between Labour and the Liberal Democrats. And the two parties were on the same power rating, even though Labour had more than 4 times as many MPs as the Liberal Democrats. So that's an interesting way of looking at the picture, and the question is whether that's true or not. And I think when you allow for resources, also discussed in this chapter, a much better picture would be that it was something like this. So the Tories had 42% of the power, Labour had 31%. The Liberal Democrats had much more power than their share of the MPs, but they weren't on even Stevens with the Labour Party. So there was a possibility of choosing a different kind of government. So why did it turn out the way it did? You probably need to think about it in a two-dimensional space. At this time, the European Union was not a really big, and indeed immigration was not really a big thing, at least in Westminster terms. And we were coming out of a period of Labour government where Labour had managed to really mess up its traditional association with civil liberties and seemed to be a kind of statist-orientated government that was wanting to introduce an identity card, despite the entirely rational opposition of the LSE to that. And so they were quite a long way away from the Liberal Democrats on an issue dimension that was very important to them, which is the civil liberties dimension. Meanwhile, the Conservatives were making, quite pro-civil liberties sorts of noises. So if you wanted to evaluate the basic position of the parties, you need to think who was closest to whom and where would a coalition government end up. So if we let's see how we do that. We draw a line between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, and then we think, well, the Conservatives have got, 5 times more MPs than the Liberal Democrats. So basically they don't have to budge very far along this line in order to create a coalition government. And the Liberal Democrats, doing this party proportionality, you get as many MPs or as many cabinet positions as you have MPs, they have to make sacrifices because they can't get complete parity as you might have expected. So that is quite good for the Conservatives because the Liberal Democrats are not very well represented. They don't have to make a great many concessions. What about the Liberal Democrats and Labour? Well, again, Labour's got, 4 times more MPs than the Liberal Democrats. So any Labour-Lib-Lab coalition is going to be pretty close to where Labour was anyway. And of course, because Labour has managed to distance itself further from the Liberal Democrats on the civil liberties thing, and perhaps because Nick Clegg was a more right-wing leader, and there was more of an ascendancy of right-wingers within the Liberal Democrats, that distance away is worse for the Liberal Democrats than this distance. Obviously, you want to be as close to your optimum point as possible. So if you think about the Liberal Democrats comparing it with Labour, a Conservative coalition offered them a great deal more. Now there's various other things. Labour was the outgoing party. It had a historically low vote. Gordon Brown was relatively discredited as Prime Minister. He resigned almost immediately. Labour didn't have a leader in place, so it was very difficult to negotiate with them and various other things as well. But I think the fundamental thing was that the Liberal Democrats did better with their deal with the Conservatives, at least they thought so. Why didn't the Labour-Conservative deal happen? Because it was clearly worse for both the Conservatives and Labour than doing a deal with the Liberal Democrats, in the sense of they would have had to cut a bargain pretty much in the middle of the space on this Gamson's law. It's not really a law, but it's a pretty good prediction. And that's obviously worse for them than this is better for Labour and this is better for the Conservatives. So that was a non-starter from the outset. But if we have a whole history of coalitions, let's say as in Germany, then we sometimes do see the 2 big parties or the 2 top parties making that kind of a deal. And then finally we could just flip through, I'll leave you to work through the rest of the thing, to see, well, what happened in terms of sharing out the government goodies. So this is the share of MPs. The Tories had 84% of the coalition MPs. They got 82% of the departmental ministers, so very, very close to Giamson's law. They got 81% of all government posts. They have 78% of cabinet positions, so they're slightly underrepresented, but not very much. If you look in the cabinet committee system, the Liberal Democrats are beginning to fill up with, junior ministers, and also they're getting more cabinet committee places. And if you actually compute using a very brilliant index that I developed some time ago, which I won't explain to you, a positional power. It wasn't done by me, it was done by a guy called Nick Allen from Royal Holloway, but he's using my index. You find that the positional power of the Tories in the government is 69%, positional power of the Liberal Democrats 31%, which is not actually all that far from their shares of the popular vote. So the Liberal Democrats made a very conscious and specific choice to try and influence overall government policy. They really were underrepresented in terms of in cabinet positions and departmental ministers. But in the overall scheme of things, they tried to make up for it through committees and particularly the kind of Nick Clegg, Danny Alexander, David Cameron, George Osborne kind of central committee. But the problem for the Liberal Democrats is that this power is behind the scenes, and they end up with just 3 departmental ministers in a government that has looked Conservative-led and has actually led to fairly strong damage to their political support and so on. But that gets you into the final aspect of the coalition, which is that it has been phenomenally stable. And some of the same sort of club ethos that used to sustain Conservative Labour duopoly has spilled over into the formation of the coalition government. In particular, the coalition government made a really important move very early on, which was to enact a law saying that parliaments would last for 5 terms. And that law is for 5 years, so they'd last a full term. That law is still in place. It doesn't actually necessarily hold, and I could discuss with you why it might be breached. We could still have a June 2014 general election. Very few people know how to do this, but I can explain it to you if you're interested. But that really has created a remarkably strong-looking, remarkably unified government, which is actually, if it does last 5 years, and if the 5-year rule becomes part of the British Constitution, which it would do if it lasts 5 years, would be quite an important fundamental adjustment to the whole party system for the future. So why don't we stop there and go to queries and questions.
Right, very good.
Just to get going, I mean, the implication of what you say at the end there, going back to what you said at the beginning about, or said earlier in the middle of the lecture about cartel parties, is that almost any party, or potentially that any party big enough to form a coalition, certainly if it had been in the parliament for very long, would be inherently, potentially part of the cabal.
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, for example, the Liberal Democrats often portray themselves as being a sort of a community-based party and a party that's more outside the two-party system, and yet they are the party with the highest number of knights and dames in their ranks amongst their MPs. So, and they have a very strong representation in the House of Lords. So they've done very well considering their size in terms of political payoffs and office payoffs. And
indeed, the implication of that would be if you wanted an honour that you should join the Liberal Democrats.
Definitely the quickest, simplest
I mean,
way.
just to cut through the...
Yeah.
Okay. Right, okay. Alistair, you had a question?
I guess I'll just ask a question based on the lecture. You suggested, it seems to suggest, over time, there could be a coalition between the two biggest parties, or something like you mentioned about Germany.
Yeah.
What is it about time that allows that to occur?
Well, I mean, if you look at Germany, what happened in the post-war period is that you have two very big parties, just as you do in the UK, the Christian Democrats and the Christian Social Union, one bloc, and then the Social Democratic Party. And over the years, after the Christian Democrats lost a sort of certain hegemony in the 60s, there would be, groupings of the Social Democrats with the Centre Party, the Free Democrats, and then there would be groupings of the CDU with the Free Democrats. And then periodically, every now and again, either the election arithmetic made that difficult, or the demands of the Free Democrats became excessive, the coalitional demands that they were making on their partners, and the two big parties have formed sort of grand coalitions or joint coalitions periodically, and that's what we have in Germany now. The CDU and the Social Democrats are in a coalition together. So I think you need to imagine that if we had a series of, for example, next year in the general election, it's quite likely we might have either another Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition or a Lib-Lab coalition, Lab-Lib coalition. So if that sequence becomes established, and it's not to say that it will do, but there's reasonable polling evidence to suspect that we are, at the moment in a pretty long-term balance between the two bigger parties. And although the Liberal Democrats are going to lose a lot of seats, probably half their MPs, even if they had 25, 30 MPs, they could still be holding the balance next time. So you could get to a point where Conservatives and Labour are both so mutually fed up with having to put up with this middle-of-the-road partner that they would think about a joint government. It's interesting that never came up in 2010, because there you had a national emergency, sort of economic climate which was very adverse. You had a Conservative opposition which really didn't manage to improve its vote very much, but you had an incumbent government with an outgoing Prime Minister and a very poor reputation. I think if the government had performed better or hadn't lost as much, you might have seen some consideration of a ConLab coalition on a national emergency kind of basis. Should have been interesting development.
Sorry. There were, though, at the time, were there not, senior Labour figures who argued after a while of attempts to form a coalition. Some of the more traditional, small c Conservative Labour senior figures eventually said the Labour Party, what you've said earlier on, has lost the election. It cannot realistically be seen to cling on to power.
Yeah.
I mean, that argument was used explicitly, was it not?
Yes, but it wasn't used to argue in favour of a ConLab coalition.
No, that's true.
Even though that would have been the,
But it de facto ruled that out as well, you could say.
I think it's, the problem with a ConLab coalition or the German CDU-CSU coalition is that if you think back to Schumpeter's argument for democracy, it's about competition between political elites. And if you suspend that competition, or if the political elites collude, then you kind of could create a very strong danger for, how government operates. And you can see some of that in a country like Austria, where in fact the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats have run the country jointly for a very long period of time, and they shuffle the ministerial positions around, but they don't really ever leave office, if you see what I mean.
Mr. Gensch.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. You talked about how the cartel party is kind of that's where we're going in the UK.
No, we've got.
Well, we've
we're
got there.
we're solidly in the middle of a cartel party system.
But it strikes me that parties like UKIP and a lot of right-wing parties just across Europe, like the PVV, thrive from not being part of that cartel, and are doing quite well out of it and kind of represent a challenge to the cartel. So do you think that if they represent enough challenge to that cartel and kind of diminish the benefits of it existing for the cartel party? Do you think that that the cartel is more likely to break up or try to kind of swallow up and open to these new parties?
Well, I think the great thing about the far-right parties, and sometimes about far-left parties as well, or left of the Social Democrat parties, like the Socialist People's Party in Denmark, is that they do start off outside of the spoils system, and they start off with clean hands, and they can they haven't got, you know, past policies that they're defending. They don't necessarily have to be realistic in the policies that they're currently advocating. So they can do, you know, populist kind of politics. And populist politics is flourishing right across Western Europe now. It's a very important development. And, you know, in some countries you have even governing parties like the Hungarian governing party at the moment running on a pretty populist kind of set of policies and altering the constitution and even eroding press freedoms and individual freedoms. So there's a danger with populism, which was very, very evident in the 1930s, and it's still there to this day. But it's very difficult for a cartel party system that has actually stopped being about mobilizing voters and expressing, you know, really genuinely transmitting what voters want to elites and become a kind of instrument of organizing voting for on behalf of the state or elites. It's very hard for them to compete with populist parties, and that's really the lesson of Western European politics the last 20 years, really, but particularly at the present point in time. Now, that's not to say that populism is sustainable. Populist parties tend to be run by incompetent leaders. They tend to have strange ideological hang-ups, like the constant fragmentation of the British far-right parties when they discover that their leaders are homosexual and they can't tolerate that, or they discover that somebody in European parties, they discover that somebody's got, you know, Jewish ancestry and they're in a far-right party, and then they fragment over that. So there's all kinds of things that go wrong with far-right parties. You know, in many ways, it doesn't take very many elections for them to become part of the cartelish system. So, for example, if you think about UKIP, they have really sustained their whole party operations on the basis of salaries paid to their MEPs and so on. And they will attract donors, and they have attracted donors, precisely because they could begin to have an influence on policy making. So I think really the cartel party system, it's very hard to break out of. The only way in which you can break out of this is to reconnect at a mass level with voters. Now, there are ways in which you could do that. And I think, for example, in some US election presidential campaigns, you see temporary ways in which people can reconnect with using social media and crowdfunding for campaign sources and so on. The interesting thing about British parties is how little of that they do, really, and have shown any inclination for doing. But even if they wanted to, it's a much trickier thing to do. You know, think of the tensions in the Conservative Party over promising an in-out referendum on the EU, which is the main way in which they're trying to respond to that populist pressure, and yet it really sort of wrecks their traditional relationship with business, or could wreck it if it was carried through.
I mean, the implication of this is that if you're an insurgent party, the Liberal Democrats until they went into government, the Liberal Democrats in their post-Liberal party form, UKIP today are the Social Democrats in the 80s, that the one thing you should avoid doing is getting too close to effectively the cartel, to being in power. So you've got this paradox that the thing you're setting out to do is to get into power, but if you do that, you risk destroying yourself. Equally, if you're inside the system, you should offer siren voices. You could argue some Conservatives are doing this with UKIP today. Siren voices because not only do you sustain your own coalition, you destroy the insurgent. Would that be true?
Yes, but I think it's a complicated problem for the established parties because they have very many more commitments. And it's very complicated for a party like the Liberal Democrats. They've managed to, you know, adapt to being in government. They've adapted in this very strange way where they're almost invisibly in government. They have a lot of behind-the-scenes influence and very few ministers. They've had a lot of political costs. They've lost half their supporters, really, in a pretty long-run way since 2010. But they have apparently, you know, I think Nick Clegg would say that he has absorbed that cost on the basis of, you know, changing the status of the party to a party of government and not a hotel party or an insurgent party with people checking in for the night and then checking out again and forgetting a week later that they ever voted for you, that kind of.
There's one more quick question, otherwise we're running out of time. I'm afraid you rather stole or you answered the question I was going to ask, which was, given that you have been in the last couple of weeks, I think it's fair to say rather critical, very critical of the proportionality delivered by the existing UK parliamentary voting system. It is odd that nevertheless the result of it, although argue perhaps less successful than it was, is nevertheless one that is by many standards a reasonably competent, reasonably clean, reasonably stable form of government. Now, are you saying that if we solved the problems to which you have strongly alluded, that this would make the system better in its own terms?
Well, I'm beginning to be a bit more sceptical because, for example, for many years.
Which way about what?
Well, about the you know, the extent to which reform of the British system is possible.
Okay.
For example, I used to argue quite seriously that coalition government would be better and more rational than one-party majority government, and yet I'm not totally clear that I could argue that case anymore. And the current coalition government seems to me to have acted, you know, in a very, very high-handed ways, not to have consulted public opinion in many ways, and to have made some significantly irrational decisions, including committing, you know, as many policy disasters as British governments have traditionally managed to achieve under one-party government. So, you know, I'm a bit more sceptical than I used to be about the value of coalitions, because it seems as if the British political elite culture is very absorptive, and it can accommodate a lot of new pressures and then reproduce pretty similar kind of centralized, unresponsive government rather easily. But nonetheless, I think you've got to think to yourself, is it sustainable for a political system to go on where you have large numbers of votes that are not being effectively represented and that aren't present in Parliament, and where the political debates are artificially and wholly artificially manipulated and constrained so that only a certain section of views gets to be debated and discussed. And I think that although you may not welcome the rise of UKIP or other things, you've just got to be realistic. In a liberal democracy, you can't have long-run discontinuities between what people are voting and what people are thinking and what people are talking about and what political elites are doing. And if you do run a system like that for a long period of time, which is what we've been doing in our kind of post-imperial phase, you're running various very serious risks, of which, for example, the collapse of public order in August 2011 was a very interesting illustration. The London riots, which suddenly Prime Minister was on holiday, the Home Secretary was away, the London Mayor was away. In 3 days, London got to be at a pretty fragile state. And that's not really the way I'd like to see a liberal democracy being run. I think you need to have more active consent, and the way to do that is to have a better, fairer, more inclusive political system. But exactly how you do that is tricky.
Okay, well then, thank you, Patrick.